It is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our next fireside chat. Shirin Ghaffray is a technology reporter for Bloomberg News and the author of Bloomberg's AI newsletter, Q and AI, an issue of which she just got out a few hours before coming here today. She regularly covers the ins and outs of the AI industry, including the increasingly massive and complex funding deals, latest research breakthroughs, and societal impact of chatbots. Shirin grew up right here in the heart of Silicon Valley, and she went to Homestead High School, which happens to be the alma mater of a pair of prominent tech leaders. Who knows who they are? Oh, that's one. And Wozniak, that's right, Jobs and Wozniak. So, Shirin, over to you.
Thank you for, thanks so much. Thank you for that intro, Ramyanberry. It's always nice coming to Stanford campus, but a little bit, the competitive side of me also comes out because I went to Berkeley, another fun fact. So it was fun seeing the Beat Cal banners on the walk-in. But no, I'm very, very honored to be here. I actually was telling James and Mohamed backstage, I studied both English and economics in college. So I love to talk to economists and academics, like many of you in the room, about what's happening in AI today, and also love to talk to people at the frontier of all that, which is James, who are really helping invent the future that we're all living through. So let's just start off with the big news this week. James, your company, Google, has had an exciting week with the release of your latest big AI model, Gemini 3. It's getting strong early reviews, as I mentioned in my newsletter, particularly in coding, but it can do more advanced reasoning, image generation. Scarily so, I saw a picture of all the tech CEOs that I thought was actually them. It was not. It was from your latest image model. How big of a step is this toward, so-called AGI? And what's your latest kind of estimate for when we're getting there?
Well, first of all, thank you. Good to be at Stanford, and thank you for the invitation. It's been quite a week, actually. In fact, just today we released Nano Banana Pro. Some people seem more excited about that, by the way, than Gemini 3, but we'll see. No, it's been an extraordinary time working on the Gemini program. The Gemini program actually began almost 3 years ago when we put together the teams from DeepMind and Google Brain to really try to have this new program of developing foundation models. So this is now the third generation of Gemini. And I think it's been quite remarkable. Hopefully some of you have seen this on a few fronts. First of all, it's always been natively multimodal as a model. We've also extraordinarily improved its thinking and reasoning capabilities, and also its performance in many disciplines, actually, including coding. And it's actually quite exciting for those of you who kind of keep a track on these kind of leaderboards and these benchmarks. I think our previous model, 2.5, was already at the top of the LMSIS kind of leaderboards. The Gemini 3 took a big jump. It's actually the first model above the 1,500 ELO rating, which is quite remarkable. And it's actually leading across pretty much all the benchmarks anybody pays attention to. One of the ones that is kind of an interesting benchmark that people have started to pay attention to is the unfortunately named Humanities Last Exam, where it actually benchmarks when it doesn't use tools at like 37%. If you use tools, it goes up to 41%. So it's quite a very performant model in that regard. So we're very pleased with it. It's exciting. Perhaps what's different this time for us is that in addition to releasing the model, we actually made it available across all the pretty much all the products right away. So if you're using search today, if you're using the Gemini app today, you can already get access to it. But I think this is, we're pleased with the progress. I think to your question about, where are we in the process to more capable systems? I think these systems, including Gemini 3, are incredibly performant, but they're still quite jagged, if you like. There's some remarkable things that will blow your mind. It's what you can do with these systems, and some things that will leave you kind of scratching your head to say, That didn't make any sense. So they're still very jagged. And I think that's one of the things that's going to have to make progress on the way to however you choose to define AGI, is getting past this jaggedness. And for many of us, we think obviously scaling will help with some of that that's going on, and scaling the architectures and all of that. But we still think if you're going to get all the way to AGI, and my colleagues and I mostly think that we're going to need a few more breakthroughs to whether it's in memory, contextual reasoning. There's a whole planning over multiple long time horizons. So there's a lot more that's going to need to happen before we get to AGI.
Can you give a time range of the latest of what you would guess?
Well, I think that's always dependent on how you define it. But I think in our minds, we would probably say somewhere in the 5 to 10 year time frame. So we're on that end of the spectrum based on how we think about how to define AGI.
And Mohamed, how about you? As James was mentioning, these tools can, on exams beat some of the smartest math geniuses, but then yet still feel, so incapable sometimes when you're asking them for help with certain day-to-day tasks and they get stuck. How are you thinking from an economic perspective about evaluating these tools? Do you care about a term like AGI, or are there other ways that you're sort of evaluating their performance?
So I care enormously, and I care mainly because I'm a parent. So in the past, the discussion with my daughters would be, my generation blew it. We're leaving you with low growth, high inequality, high debt, a climate crisis. I'm sorry. Now it is, we're leaving you with all that, but we have tools, and we have one tool in particular, AI, that promises the sorts of productivity improvement, an increase in inclusive growth that can answer a lot of the problems we have. So I certainly care a great deal. And economists who want to answer the question about how do we grow better, more sustainably, how do we grow more inclusively and at a high rate, care a great deal. The issue we have is we get captivated by James and others who are working on AI, because it's so exciting. The progress is so quick. I lived through this. 2 years ago, I was amazed that I could ask a question and get an answer. Now I'm amazed that I have an intellectual companion and that intellectual companion has over 100 PhDs. Are they always right? No, but they're a hell of a lot better than anything else. And they reason with you. So you cannot but be amazed with those who are working on AI. But as the previous panel shows you, the problem comes to those working with AI. And those working with AI don't attract enough attention as those working on AI. So I go through this exercise. What if we froze progress today? Would we exploit the incredible productivity potential that we have? And the answer is we've got to deal with lots of things. We heard about diffusion today. Diffusion is really hard. It has a retraining element. It has to have a program element, government policy. I'm glad there's a panel. Secondly, we have to deal with the bad actor problem. Someone said in the earlier panel, a company that has one bad experience will slow the whole thing down. But imagine if we get the bad actor problem. We lack harmonized regulation. We lack harmonized standards. We have to deal with the financial bubble that we're creating, which, by the way, is a good thing because it will leave society better off, even though there'll be quite a bit of tears in the investment world. And then we've got to work with mindset. I do not use the term you heard before, automation and augmentation. I use labor displacement and labor enhancement because it's about people. And that's important to put it that way because companies, if you put automation, augmentation, companies will translate in their mind automation equals cost reduction, equal efficiency, and most of the focus will go on that element. But the promise of AI is in labor enhancement. You heard it before here. And that requires a different mindset. And most companies I deal with, there are a few exceptions, but most companies I deal with are still in the cost minimization. And if that happens, social acceptance will become an issue. So I think I'm really excited, but I wish we did a little bit more and this is us collectively, on dealing with these issues that have not to work on AI, but working with AI. That's
Okay, popular answer. And I think you
I
hit
paid
on
him.
like 5 of the topics I wanted to ask about in one question, so that's great. I want to talk a little bit more about Google since we have you here, James, and just the shift that's been happening at the company. You've been at Google since, I looked it up, January 2022, if I'm correct. And that's a little less than a year before ChatGPT came out, right? Back then, the perception when ChatGPT came out was that Google was at risk of losing its edge in AI. Until then, Google was sort of this undisputed leader, and now there's this upstart in the race. And could Google, which is this very research-intensive organization, translate that into the kind of product speed that we saw coming out of smaller companies? Fast forward to now, Gemini 3's out, performing well. How has the company changed its AI strategy or culture since you've been at the firm?
Yeah, and one of the things that's always been extraordinary about Google is just the incredible kind of foundational research that goes on at Google. It really has been quite extraordinary for a very long time. Actually, but the very first time I ever interacted with Google was actually when the founders made me an offer in 2001 to work in research. I didn't go at the time, but that foundation's always been there. And I think if you think about much of the foundation for what has shaped this AI moment, these are all research breakthroughs from Google, the transformer, which is the foundation of large language models, diffusion models. You can go through a whole range of the underlying research breakthroughs happened, starting in the 2010s, 2015s, and so on. So the research foundation has always been very strong. And I think what has shifted is that, first of all, the researchers continue to be strong. I think the breakthroughs keep coming. But I think what's shifted is a more confident way and approach to actually translate that into products, and actually have these capabilities turn up into products. That's why I think the launch of Gemini 3 is kind of, in some ways, is the best so far, because you not only have an extraordinarily strong foundation model or set of models, but you've also got it showing up on the same day of launch of the model in actual products. So the productization and the product innovation and the pace of that has shifted. I think the other thing that has also shifted is I think there's a much more kind of comfortable and confident embrace of two things that sometimes people think of as being in conflict, about we don't. And you've heard us talk about this idea of being bold and responsible. I think there's such strong confidence on both of those things. And I think on the bold part, it isn't to say be reckless, but be unabashed about the potential, the possibility of this technology, and push it to make it the most useful, and be unabashed about that. I think there was a time when Google had kind of retreated from that a little bit and being as confident about that. So you've got, that's kind of on the bold side. At the same time, this strong continued commitment to being responsible. I mean, we're celebrating today, Gemini 3 a couple of days ago and Nano Banana today. But at the same time, one of the things that we also announced today is that we've actually now built in SynthID into all of our generative systems.
And what is SynthID for this?
So SynthID is a way to actually watermark the synthetically generated images, for example, in all of our surfaces. And in fact, now, today, you could actually, if you put in an image like the one you just mentioned, you can actually put it into the Gemini app and ask if this was generated synthetically by Google systems, and it'll tell you. So we're pushing both these ideas. So I think that's one of the changes you see. So you see people are much more self-confident, et cetera. One thing I wanted to add, though, is it links back to some of what Mohamed is describing. Part of that self-confidence also comes with the view that, so we think of this space as much wider than chatbots, actually. So when we think about what's the potential of this technology, we're thinking about how it empowers people with all these kind of useful tools and search and useful tools for any individual, language translation, any number of those things. But we also think about the economic potential, as Mohamed is describing, but that's not all. We think a lot about how this advances science, and we're actually extraordinarily proud of the ways we're using this technology to advance science. I mean, everybody knows obviously of AlphaFold because we got Nobel Prizes for it. My colleagues got Nobel Prizes, but that's just one of like 15 things I could give you examples of in the sciences where we've used this technology to actually make breakthrough progress on important areas of science, with not just biology, but material science and so. So the potential for scientific advancement is such a strong reason we're doing this. And then finally, we also think about this, how does this translate into real societal, helping us tackle real societal challenges that are, already here today. So the recipients and the beneficiaries of this may never think that AI did it, but we know it did. I'll give you one good example, just because we hit a milestone recently, last month. So we've been working in the last 2 years on idea of how do you do more accurate flood predictions. We know the prevalence of floods has gone up. They're more intense. They're more frequent everywhere around the world. And what began as literally a small pilot 2 years ago in Bangladesh, we now cover 150 countries. That was a milestone from a month ago. And in places where more than 2 billion people live. That's today. Now, will those people think, oh, AI did this? No, they'll probably think, oh, I got a flood alert. I better get out of the way. So I think applying these technologies to real societal challenges is also something we think about. So all of these things are kind of what motivate a lot of what we're doing. So I think you're seeing Google take seriously all of those things boldly, but also work very hard to try to be responsible about how we do it.
Just a quick follow on that. I saw this idea floated somewhere, I think, on social media. But do you think that sometimes it may help companies to not necessarily brand everything as AI, because that can intimidate or scare people? Something like that flood alert, for example.
That's true. I don't know if any of those people who get those flood alerts think it's AI, as I said, right? But there's lots of things. To that point, I'm always amazed, and as you might expect to do these surveys, the number of people who don't think Google Translate is AI. They just think it's just Google Translate, right? It's not branded AI. But even there, in the case of Google Translate, a lot of the progress we've been making recently, I mean, in the last year, we added another 110 new languages to Google Translate, so now it's 250. We actually have a moonshot goal to get to 1,000, right? So we keep working on those things. They're not always branded AI, but we know that they're all being made possible through the power of this transformative technology.
So Shirin, I go the other way. Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't think the AI community tells enough stories.
How so?
When you go to a developing country, and James can speak to that because he was involved at the UN, they are really excited.
That's true.
They're excited about what AI can do to help a clinic in a small village. They're excited about how AI can enhance a school that otherwise has massive resource constraints. They're excited about the potential for faster drug development. And they see this as a leapfrogging opportunity that they would not have otherwise.
Yeah, actually, just to add, so what Mohamed's referring to, so for up until the end of last year, I was co-chairing this UN high-level body on AI, and as you might expect, we're engaging with all the member states around the world. And two things from that are worth noting. One is, as Mohamed said, in all the views from the different countries, those in the global south were relatively more optimistic about AI than in Western Europe and the United States, which is interesting for perhaps the reasons Mohamed is describing. The second thing I'll also note, when we're having discussions about, in that body, about the risks of AI, of course everybody will talk about misapplication and misuse and all the things we all imagine, misapplication and misuse. Members of the body and feedback from the Global South insisted we add a third kind of miss, and this was misuse as a risk. I thought that was interesting. So if you actually look at the materials from that UN high-level body, misuse was actually labeled as one of the potential risks, particularly for communities and places that might not have all the other alternative ways to solve, whether it's for healthcare or education, and you're misusing this technology when in fact it could help, because the other ways of solving it, such as investment and all of that, hasn't showed up yet. So that was interesting.
Makes sense. Mohamed, you have a very interesting and provocative op-ed this morning. Is that right, in the New York Times?
Yeah, the timing is totally coincidental. Okay, unless Ramin spoke to somebody.
And I believe the title, and I'm paraphrasing here, is something like, we're an AI bubble, maybe that's okay.
Yeah.
Can you explain why you're not worried about an AI bubble, or why some kinds of AI bubbles might be okay?
So first, it is more likely than not that we are in an AI bubble. I've lived through various bubbles, and you start seeing characteristics. One, when it becomes rational to overinvest. And you hear why it's rational. The payoff is so huge. And then there's behavioral aspects, why it makes sense. Oh, if we fall behind, that risk is much higher than the risk of overinvesting. So you start seeing an incentive structure and a behavioral structure develop in the core element of where the bubble starts. And this is not, and James will probably contradict me, but this is not a winner, many winners. There's going to be few winners, much less than what people are betting on. Then you start seeing what we saw during the dot-com bubble, which are companies that simply put an AI label on what they do. They don't fundamentally change what they do, and they attract money. Okay? So valuation gets pushed up. Then you start seeing the index effect. You all heard that it's 7 companies that have pulled up the index, but then a lot of money is passively managed against the index. So that attracts more money into the index. It pulls up all the people in the index to levels that they shouldn't be. Then you start seeing volatility initially collapse. And what does volatility do? When it collapses, it attracts more investment. So you see these elements play out in there. So are there going to be tiers? Absolutely. I have no doubt in my mind that quite a bit of money is going to be lost by a few people.
Who's going to lose the money? Who do you think is most
It's going to
vulnerable?
be people who are betting on those working on foundational models that simply cannot sustain it. You will see the sorts of behavior you saw before the financial crisis, but I don't want to suggest this is it, but enormous debt financing, circular financing, a lot of financial engineerings like we had with securitization. Securitization was good, but people got carried away completely on there. So you're going to see it in where there isn't enough revenue to sustain. I don't worry about Google, I don't worry about NVIDIA, I don't worry about Microsoft, but I worry about some other companies that are in this arms race without multi-sources of revenues. Okay, so you're going to also see it in exactly what we saw in pet.com. I don't know how many of you remember pet.com. Okay, it was absurd. I remember once a Bloomberg page on a company that had done an IPO. Okay, it was a dot-com that had no yet defined business, but it was a dot-com business that attracted money. So you see all that. However, all this will lead to a much better outcome, because what this allows is that it allows the capital markets to throw a tremendous amount of money at this area, much more than government financing could ever do. And it generates a sort of competition that enables innovation at a much faster rate than it would otherwise. And I truly believe that at the end of all this, and the New York Times put a rainbow in this, at the end of all this is higher productivity, higher growth. So society as a whole will be better off. The dynamics that lead to this bubble are totally rational to begin with, but then they start becoming irrational. But this is not the tulip bubble where there's the outcome is going to be that we're better off. The alternative model of not enough funding for the industry would leave us worse off, or a centralized approach would leave us worse off.
Interesting. James, what do you think? Are we in an AI bubble?
Well, at some level, I don't think it matters in the following sense. I think on the one hand, let me tell you what I like about this moment, is the fact that there's enormous investments into infrastructure. Much of it was already much needed. Think about investments in energy infrastructure to the grid and so forth. I think that's a useful thing. I think so the investments in that sense are going to be useful for a very long time, quite aside from whether we're in a bubble or not. The other reason I don't worry about it as much, and most of us don't worry about it as much, is that I think it's important to remember, and I think this is Stanford, we're talking about economics. There's 2 characteristics of this technology that I think are fundamentally so exciting. It's a general purpose technology, bubble or not, A bit like what the internet was, if you use the pet.com example. Whatever happened, the internet still happened. It still transformed economies. It still transformed things, whether there was a momentary bubble or not. So it's a general purpose technology. I think that's foundationally important. But and often that, encourages people to make analogies to the Industrial Revolution and all of that. And I think all of that is true. But there's another aspect I think that is often, again, underappreciated about this technology. It's an invention for inventing, which I think is interesting, right? I think, so if we're going to draw historical analogies for that, and it's not the Industrial Revolution I'd look to for analogies. I'd probably look to the Enlightenment. Think about the scientific revolutions, the discoveries, the tools, the instruments we made that allowed so many other things to happen much later. So because of these underlying characteristics, I don't worry about the bubble part of this. I should say, though, that as excited as I am, as Mohamed says, about the productivity potential, we've all seen lots of estimates around this in the trillions of productivity gains and all of that. I actually think none of that is guaranteed, actually. And I think there's a danger also that we assume that all of that is going to happen. And I just think this is where it's worth thinking through, both. It's kind of like the old Solow paradox at some level, which is, you see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. And you have to think about, okay, what are the things that are going to have to happen for those productivity gains to actually be realized? And I think lots has to happen. I think adoption is one of those things, and adoption is fundamentally important because it's not enough for the tech industries and places like Google to embrace and adopt these technologies and how we do coding and all of this stuff. After all, the economists in the room know the tech industry is what, 4 or 5% of the US labor force? It's small. It doesn't matter in labor productivity terms. I think you have to get adoption in many of the large sectors in the economy. So that has to happen. I think what also has to happen is we have to see this applied in productivity enhancing use cases. And that hasn't quite happened yet, I don't think, not at scale anyway. And that's going to take time. And then I think we're going to need to see, back to some of what happened to the Solow paradox, or even the Industrial Revolution, if you like, until you see kind of the reorganization and rearrangement of processes and structures to take advantage of this technology, you won't see those productivity gains. It's kind of like what happened in the past, students of history will know this. It wasn't enough just to put an engine into an old-time factory floor that had never seen an engine before. You had to rearrange the workflows and how things work before you could see the gain. So that's going to take a lot of work. Never mind all the other co-investments and co-innovations and evolutions, including investments in empowering workers and work in those sectors to actually take advantage of it. So that's a lot to ask for, and it's going to take time. So I often worry when, even many of my friends and peers on the technical side get excited, and we all get excited about the pace of the technology. And imagine that the cascade of all of that in the economy will happen at the same pace. I just don't buy that. I think it's going to take, that's going to be much slower than we think the pace of advancing of the technology is.
How long do you think it will take before we see this reflected in productivity increases that are measurable?
I'd throw this back to all of us. It depends how quickly companies take advantage of this, how quickly large sectors adopt this, how quickly the rearrangement of workflows and all of that actually happens. That's what's going to pace how quickly this happened.
So in the meantime, we're making this, or the industry is making this bet, right, on there will be continued demand. This will take off in a meaningful way across sectors and different industries, and building out these massive data centers, right, to power the AI models that you all are building and training and running. Now, what happens when you start running into energy concerns around the grids in different areas where you're building these out, around energy supply, around water impact? How are you guys thinking about that, and how big of an issue do you see that becoming as the scale of these data centers is growing?
Yeah, I think the energy question is an important one, particularly with respect to AI, and it is. We think of it in several parts. I think on the one hand, at least in our case, we're so committed, and we've had these ambitions for a very long time, to build new sources of energy. I mean, Google's had for a long time, since 2018 actually, this moonshot goal to be 24/7 carbon-free, right? It's a moonshot. We're working as hard as we can to get there. But part of that moonshot is also trying to make big investments. So if you've, in addition to the investments we've made in data centers, you may have noticed that this year we've made huge investments in nuclear, in fusion technology, in geothermal. We actually have a couple of data centers that are fully operational in geothermal energy, and we've even invested in hydro in Pennsylvania. So we're making these huge investments as part of our ambition and moonshot to get to that. So that's one piece. The other thing to think about is what we're also doing to drive the efficiency of our models. I think we're the first, a couple of months ago, my colleagues and I actually put out a paper where we actually looked at, try to understand what is the energy footprint of a median Gemini prompt? What does that actually cost? And what are we doing to reduce the cost of that? Because I think one of the things that's often missed on the energy consumption is when you're doing things at the scale at which we do them, there's a whole bunch of scale efficiencies that we get. Let me mention a few. So first of all, there's the fact that the models themselves are becoming more efficient. If you notice that when we put out a Gemini 3 model, there's a pro version, and you'll see a flash version that's a distilled down, much, much more efficient version. So we have models that span the cost and efficiency frontier. And in fact, most users are using the flash model. So there's work on the models themselves. Then the things that we're doing in our stack in itself, and I'll get technical just for a quick second for those who care about this. So in terms of actually when you do things at the kind of scale we do, we can do what's called batch inferencing. For example, when we actually create batches of inference, small batches, large batches. We can do things like speculative decoding, where you actually you have a smaller model kind of speculate on what the bigger model is going to need to decode, and you have those work in tandem. Adds extraordinary efficiency. There are these things called KV caching, where you kind of you save some of the generation of tokens you've done from previous token predictions, and then only build on them. It saves you an enormous amount if you're doing this at scale. And then you do what's called disaggregated serving, where you kind of run on your accelerators, you kind of do prefill over here, and you do decoding over here, and you come. So there's all these techniques, and that's what's allowed us, for example, in the last year, we've actually been able to improve. This is a paper you'll probably see hopefully be published soon in Nature, but it's already in preprint. We've actually been able to, over the last year, improve the efficiency of serving a Gemini prompt by 44x. So we're doing that just in a year, just from all these techniques. And you can do that when you're doing it at the scale at which you're processing tokens. And then the final thing I'll say is we're also spending an enormous amount actually building our own chips. We just announced, for example, Ironwood, which is a chip built specifically to optimize for inference, to make it about as efficient as possible for inference. So I think when you have when you're working up and down the stack that way, there's so much that you can do. But let me say one final thing, if I may, on this. I think it's one thing, obviously, to work very hard on the energy efficiency in the ways that I just described. But it's important not to also not forget how we're actually applying this technology to help with emissions. So, one of the things, we actually publish an annual report on this. One of the things we highlighted this year in our report was that, in the last year, 5 of our products that we actually designed specifically to reduce emission were able to reduce, I think the number was 26 million tons of carbon emissions. And the 26 million tons is a useful number because if you compare that to our actual emissions as a company, that number was only like 11 million tons. So I think the possibility of this technology to actually help address emissions should also not be discounted when we have this conversation about the use of AI and energy.
Shirin, can I go back to your economic question for a minute? Because he importantly mentioned the Solow paradox. Right? And he used the E word, if you're sophisticated up here, which was enlightenment. If you like me down here, the E word is electricity. Okay, I think there's this general purpose technology as the introduction of electricity. And the reason why that's important is that in order to get to the productivity improvement, there's a journey. And that journey has economic effects. If it weren't for AI, we would probably be in recession today. Okay. You know, one of the big puzzles for the economists has been, how is it that we've thrown everything at this economy this year? Okay. We have thrown uncertainty, corporate uncertainty. We have done all sorts of things with the trading system. We have seen the K-shaped economy get worse, where low-income people are, and yet we produced 3.6% growth in the second quarter. We probably produced 3% growth in the third quarter, and if you look at the Atlanta Now estimate for the fourth quarter, it's 4%. Why? Depending on who you ask, because the wealth effect is hard to estimate, about 60 to 80% of growth, and Jason Furman goes 90%, is due to you building the infrastructure to allow for electricity, what he has been talking about. So we are already feeling the effects. We're feeling it from the demand side, and the destination will feel it from the supply side. So it's really important to recognize that it is playing out today. And it is a reason why US growth is outperforming so much European growth.
So Mohamed, it sounds like you're not too concerned about the risk of a bubble, or that you're not too concerned about the electricity. What is your biggest concern about the economic uncertainty here? Is it job displacement, which you mentioned earlier, or are there other risks that are not at all economic related that keep you up at night? But I'm curious.
So most innovations have two characteristics. One is J-curve in terms of the impact, okay? And the other one is the first round has excesses. We're human. The minute you reduce a barrier to an exciting opportunity, we overconsume it and we overproduce it. We saw this with the Industrial Revolution. We saw it with fiber optics, okay, securitization. What worries me is social acceptance, maintaining social acceptance. When I talk to people, I tell them the journey is important as the destination. And they look at me, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So I tell them, when my daughter was young, once a year, I would take her to Disneyland. And you cannot believe the excitement. The night before, the morning, we have the ears on. We are all focused on the destination. And of course, my daughter would want to get there when it opens, when the park opens. So what is it? Southern California rush hour. So what would happen during the journey that we had never thought about is I would hear 100 times, are we there, Dad? Are we there yet, Dad? Then I would hear that thing a parent hates to hear. I feel sick. Then she would be sick. And by the time we got there, because we didn't manage the journey, the excitement of the destination wasn't quite the same. Yeah. We had argued in the car smelled. So I worry that I worry about the need to manage this journey to a really exciting destination.
Makes sense. James, what are you most excited about in the next year ahead, and what keeps you up at night with regard to AI?
Well, I'm very excited about the extraordinary progress that this technology is making, but also in particular to the way in which hopefully we and many others are starting to put it to good use. And I worry, and I think the good use part of it is so important for it because we shouldn't assume that that'll be automatic either, right? I think applying this technology to tackle society's biggest challenges, to the economy, to science, that's not automatic either. So I worry that we may not fully realize that. And I think if that's the thing that actually motivates, I think, most of us, which it is. I remember when I did my PhD 30 years ago, I imagined in AI, I imagined this to be an incredibly useful technology. So if part of the motivation is to deliver on all these exciting possibilities and we don't, I worry about that. So that keeps me up at night. I also, I'm both excited about that, but also worried about that. I also worry quite a bit about, maybe it's a bit to Mohamed's journey point, about in the labor markets, not the joblessness questions, I actually don't worry too much about that or display, but the transitions associated with the labor markets, of which we're going to have very many transitions in skills, in occupations, and even the wage effects that come with that. So I think I worry a lot about those kinds of labor market transitions that we're going to need to think about. And then the other thing I worry about on the economic front, there's something else, is I think it's easy to imagine all these exciting possibilities. I imagine them, I think about them all the time. But there's nothing that says everybody will automatically benefit from that. I mean, we've seen enough examples historically. Think about what happened with the COVID vaccines. I mean, we invented vaccines, the world invented vaccines, but for a while, not everybody got access to them. Some places did and others didn't. So even if we create the economic bounty or the results of these scientific discoveries, how do we make sure that in fact, everybody has access to those and benefits from those is something that I think a lot about.
But at his labor market point, when we run, and it was mentioned before, at the equivalent of full employment, and we have growth of 3 to 4%, which is above potential, you hardly ever got someone that started worrying about labor market weakness. Today, we continue to have high growth, and yet people are worrying about labor market weakness. Normally, you'd worry about high inflation, right? And it shows you that one thing that has to be managed carefully is to avoid the divergence of growth going this way and the labor market going this way. Yeah.
How do we make sure that the gains of AI are distributed right to everyone and not just concentrated, like Mohamed, you were saying, there is a risk that these gains could be concentrated in a few companies?
So I think of it, I think this is a shared responsibility. If you go to the 4 things I mentioned that could go wrong when it comes to working with AI, it has an element of the individual, willingness to retool, retrain, openness, willingness to experiment with AI. It has an element of companies, willingness to not just pursue cost minimization, but also revenue enhancement and labor enhancement. And it has an element of governments. We heard in the first session, okay, that a lot of the response, I think it was you who said it, is when people lose their jobs. Okay, so you wait for the crisis. That's not going to help in a situation like this. So I think of it as a shared responsibility. And if you focus on just one element of these 3, you're going to get it wrong.
And do you think government should have a role in that?
I think if we don't have standards, if we don't have regulation, if we don't have a labor market policy that understands that it's like electricity, we're changing not just what people do, we're changing how people do it. Right.
And James, what about you? Do you think government should and needs to play a role at this stage in regulating AI?
Yes. I mean, I think we've said, and my colleagues and I have said, this is too important not to regulate, but it's too important not to make, we have to make sure we regulate it well. And when I think about regulation, I think, it kind of has to do 2 things at the same time. I think on the one end, of course, we should address all the complexities and risks that we see with the technology like this. It's a powerful technology. At the same time, so regulation should pay attention to that. At the same time, regulation should also enable the possibilities we see from this technology. So I think when regulation works well, it does both things at the same time. That's why you often see there's some countries that are trying to do both those things. I always like the example of Singapore that's trying to work on both of those things. So I think regulation should do both of those things. But the hardest thing I think for regulation of a technology like this is how do you make sure approaches to regulation are light-footed enough and adaptive enough to keep up with the way the technology is actually evolving. So I'm always, surprised sometimes when the things that people are trying to solve with regulation, the technology has already progressed. Not that the questions have gone away; they're just new questions. So you always want to make sure you're solving the emerging new things and solving for those as opposed to the past. So I think there's a nimbleness, which probably suggests some light-footedness to that I think is important. Can I just say two other quick things very quickly?
Sure.
I feel like I didn't quite answer your question where you said, what else are you excited about? The other things I'm excited about, by the way, which again, we also don't talk enough about, is the way in which AI is actually helping to advance a whole bunch of adjacent fields. So think about AI and robotics. I think that's extraordinary. I think we're going to start to see progress in robotics actually catch up, if you like. So sure, there's been lots of progress in robotics, but it's been kind of lagging a little bit. I think it's about to see some advances. You only have to look at what's happening with these vision language action models, for example, for robotics, or even what Waymo's doing now, and all of that. I think that's great. The other area I'm excited about where AI is enabling progress is actually in quantum. So the quantum AI team and group was actually one of my teams where we just had extraordinary breakthroughs this year. One of them, which was I think a big enough deal last month to make the cover of Nature, where we're going to start to see quantum technologists make more progress and start to do useful things, which they haven't done so far. So I'm very excited about that.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And next year, we'll have more breakthroughs in quantum, hopefully, to talk about in addition to AI.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.